everyone, and welcome back. It's time for the third installment of making a historically accurate Gonzo cosplay from the Muppets Christmas Carol, and we are finally getting into coats. That's right, there's more than one. Gonzo is actually wearing both a coat and an overcoat. And even though you almost never see the underneath coat, the standard coat, I am making that one. I feel like it's necessary because it just adds to the accuracy of the ensemble. The fact that this is not a frock coat on the exterior, it is a proper overcoat. It's winter in London. It makes sense to have that overcoat. So I'm going to be doing both. Wish me luck in getting all of this done in time. This video, though, is going to be all about that coat, the one that he is wearing as a regular part of his suit. And though you can barely see it, and will still barely see it on me, there is a lot of detail to cover here, not just in the construction, but in the design portion as well. But before we get into that, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor for the video this week, Casetify. I rely heavily on my phone to keep me connected for my job and my friends and family around the world. It's with me all day, so it's important to keep it safe. With Casetify, I can not only protect my phone, but my health and the environment. They offer a huge variety of case designs that are made from recycled material, impact resistant, and even have antimicrobial coating. It seems like an endless selection of designs which are also customizable. They even collaborated with the Louvre. All of the cases I am trying out are made from either recycled or plant-based materials, and one of them is even compostable. With the Casetify program, they've already recycled 51,000 phone cases and have partnered with earthday.org to plant a tree for every compostable case sold. Everything is completely non-toxic and non-hazardous. Even the packaging is 100% recycled. And none of this means a lack of protection. Their impact cases, like the compostable style, are drop-proof up to 6.6 feet, and the ultra-impact cases can go up to 9.8 feet with the addition of their Chi-Tech 2.0 shock-absorbing protection without adding annoying bulk, so you never have to worry about missing that pocket again, even those really weird ones in the back of your coattails. So go to casetify.com/NicoleR to save 15% off your order today. You know your phone will be well protected, stylish, and outfitted in sustainable options. Thanks again to Casetify for sponsoring this week's video, and boy is it a video! I'm not gonna dive deep into some really big historical research for this one because there is so much that I have to talk about when it comes to the design and the construction of this. So instead, what I first want to do is do a really fast historical overview of the terminology that I'm using here. Now, I do want to refer to this as a coat. It is also historically accurate to refer to it specifically as a tailcoat. Later on in the century, they start using the terminology a swallowtail coat, which I think is a really pretty name for that. But this is particularly referring to that style that is short in front and long in back. It has narrow tails to it. The types of coats that have these skirts that go all the way to around the front, those are frock coats. We also have overcoats, which are defined more by the fact that they are meant to go over their outerwear. They're larger, they're meant to fit over your regular coat. They might be a heavier fabric or fully lined, so there are going to be adjustments a little bit in construction, more so than in the overall design between, say, that and a frock coat. Things like greatcoats have the cape on top, and there are lots of other variations that are specific to a job or specific to an activity. I want to also specify that these are different from jackets. Jackets in this era are defined by the fact that they do not have skirts. So they are shorter garments. They are worn more by children or by people who need clothing that functions for labor, physical labor, where they don't want the skirted portion of the garment because it might get in the way. So it is a more practical garment. This is one of the reasons why, despite how little I can see of what Gonzo is wearing of this brown coat, I can pretty well justify that it is a tailcoat because it's short in the front and because it's not likely that as the character of Charles Dickens he would be wearing a jacket. He's older and he's not doing hard work. The couple of times where Gonzo is actually doing labor in the movie, he does change into entirely different outfits, which just speaks to how amazing Anne Hollywood and Polly Smith were in just coming up with all the little details on this, because he has multiple outfit changes, he has all of the correct layers, and it's just, I love it so much. So when it comes to what we can see Gonzo wearing of this brown coat, we see the short front that has a satin lapel and a single breasted, meaning one side of buttons. that's all we can really see in terms of details. And pretty immediately I was finding that this particular style of coat is not something that you're going to find in the early 1840s. It is around earlier, but by the 1840s you more typically see double-breasted coats that have a sort of additional strip in the front to create that double-breasted length that you need, and that goes up into the lapel so that seam is visible there. You're going to continue seeing the buttons and buttonholes the whole way up, which is a remnant of earlier styles, especially military styles of that tailcoat. The interesting thing is, as we're making our way into the 1840s, pad stitching has become the norm, meaning that the collars and lapels are stitched in order to have them folded back in a permanent position. So they're actually stitched with an inner lining layer and the exterior fabric in a visible way on the exterior of the under part of the collar. So it holds itself back and folds nicely and holds to the body and doesn't kind of like stick up and out, which means that all of those buttons and buttonholes are pretty much non-functional. If you buttoned all the way across, the garment wants to flap back and you're going to visibly see all of that pad stitching, which I found it really interesting. A lot of museums will button up a little further than they should for these garments and you'll begin to see just a little hint of pad stitching. So this is an interesting transition where the style hasn't quite kept up with all of the changes in construction techniques. So there is a transition, not surprisingly, occurring again in this era when it comes to the way the lapels are done. Now, I did not find any that had satin on the lapels. I did find some that had velvet on the collar. I considered doing that, but it is fairly expensive. I couldn't find quite the right color, and I actually found a historical example of a coat that looked like it was completely finished with the velvet added later. So this is an option if I do want to go back and change that at a later date, but for right now, I'm not dealing with that. Some of the wools, however, are frankly shiny enough that they start to look almost like satin, and I spent a good long while trying to find just the right fabric for this, and I ended up with a wool and cashmere blend that has a bit of a furry nap to it, which is just perfect for that era. There are definitely examples of that, and it has a beautiful shine to it. So I found a fabric that will in some ways mimic this sort of satiny texture that we see on Gonzo's original, but it won't be a difference between the lapel and the actual coat body. Obviously, as well, it's going to be double-breasted rather than single-breasted. So this gave me the basic design elements that I needed for the front of the coat. There are a few other details as I went along, the cuffs, the size of the tails in the back, and some other little details like that that I had to decide, but there's a fairly universal appearance aside from things like proportions or little details. So I had a pretty good idea of what I was going to be doing in terms of the look of this. Then it came down to figuring out the rest of it, figuring out the pattern and the fit and the construction, which, so interestingly enough, I know a fair amount about 18th century men's tailoring. I was fortunate enough to learn quite a bit from Mark Hutter, who's the master tailor at Colonial Williamsburg, and I know a decent amount of early 20th century tailoring techniques because I've read through as many manuals and books and instructions as I can possibly get my hands on from the time. So there's a lot of documentation for late 19th, early 20th century. And the in-between is not linear. There's some weird stuff that happens. It goes in and goes back out again, and it's only around for like 10, 20 years. It's very brief, it's very weird. So I don't want to assume that there is a direct transition between the two, because there's not. And finding information on what was happening in what decade is really difficult. There's not a lot of information on menswear out there. What I did find was a drafting manual that got me part of the way there because it started getting really screwy with the numbers and it just did not work. It didn't make sense. They were off somewhere on some things and weren't explaining a lot, so I ended up kind of freehanding a lot of it after I got the basic shapes, which turned out really well, but it's not something I'm going to recommend to anybody to use anytime soon. When it came down then to all of the construction, I referenced the one example that I could find of a men's coat that had all of the patterns taken and the notes made on how things were assembled and how the interior structures were done, the interfacings, which came from An Agreeable Tyrant, which is an exhibit at the DAR Museum that they put out a book on, and in the back of the book they have some of those details from some of the garments in the exhibition. So Mark Hutter and Mike McCarty, also from the tailor shop, took details off of a coat and trouser set from the early 1830s and have all of that in there. So that was immensely useful because I was able to sort of extrapolate that information and apply it to slightly later styles. And though I couldn't find anything that showed me all the different layers for early 1840s, I did find plenty of examples from the 1840s of original coats with detail shots and interior shots, because both LACMA and Augusta auctions were very good at that for this particular type of garment. So I was very, very fortunate that I found lots of great examples that I could reference the whole way through, and I just had to fill in some of the smaller gaps of information with knowledge that I already had. So there are some assumptions that I had to make, but they are very, very, very minor ones, and hopefully someday I will be able to actually get my hands on one of these garments and learn a little bit more and get more detail to it. But for the most part, I tried very, very hard to make sure that every single step I was taking, every single type of stitch, shape of piece, assembly method, everything was supported in some format, because there's not a lot of information out there on this particular era when it comes to tailoring. There's a lot later and there's a little bit earlier, but it's sort of a gap in between that I really wanted to take the time to start to fill in. After patterning and doing a mock-up, it came down to a lot of cutting. There are actually 59 independent pieces on this coat, not including the 20 covered buttons, so there is a lot of marking. And you'll notice I do not use seam allowance when I'm making up the patterns. That way I actually have the marking for where I need to do my stitching for later, and every single piece will get marked up in some way. The inner layers are made out of a linen canvas for most of the basic structure. Then there's also a few layers of red wool flannel. This is something that I found examples of in a lot of the historic garments that I could see inside of a little bit, and this is pretty unique to this era. I don't really see it much before or after. And I also have a little bit of lining to add. There's a silk twill in the side area, and then a glazed cotton for the sleeve lining. Most of the pieces will also be thread marked in addition to the chalk marking, since that can rub off and disappear. Thread marking is done by having the two layers, since most of your pieces in pairs, laid down together, stitching a very loose running stitch, pulling them apart and clipping those threads midway. You end up with all these little tiny thread ends that give you exact seam allowances. I can then get started stitching together some of the first pieces, such as the center front seam, which connects that front piece to the extension for the buttonholes. This is all done by hand using a back stitch. I did not use a sewing machine for almost any of this garment, just because they wouldn't have had them, and oh man, it took a very long time for that reason. I also had to do a center front seam for the canvas layer because it is so curved at front. I can't just form the canvas around this. It needs that curve as well. I'm connecting these two layers in the flattest way possible, which is just to lay them on top of each other and catch stitch them to each other. This is also useful if you need to piece together, such as I did with that little corner up on top, just because that saves me a lot of fabric to piece in that small section. And then I can lay it out to the front. I'm working over a tailor's ham just because there's so much curve to this front, and get everything basted into place before we start the pad stitching. The pad stitching for this particular era seems a little bit different than I'm used to. The first level of pad stitching is done around the chest and neck area. It goes through to the exterior and will be hidden by the lapel, but this extends far beyond the fold line of where the lapel will be, which is not something I usually see in later eras. To top it off, the stitch that is used is slightly different than the modern pad stitch that we're used to seeing. This is more of a zigzag stitch. It works in a very similar manner, but it does mean that I have to turn the piece back and forth as I run each direction, rather than the modern pad stitching, which allows you to go up and down without moving the piece around. Once I have the pad stitching in the chest and the upper portion of the lapel done, they all seem to end somewhere around halfway down the button piece. I was then able to trim back the canvas so that way it doesn't extend into the seam allowance, and start working on finishing the edges. I realized that I probably should have stitched the skirt portion onto the front body before I did the canvas work, but it does give me one less thing that manipulates around, because unfortunately the fabric that I'm working with does not have a clean cut edge, meaning I will have to finish all of my edges. Though it is a pretty heavy wool and very close to a broadcloth, it is not quite able to hold a cut edge. So some of the things that you'll see me doing throughout this process will be to make sure that that is not an issue and that nothing frays out and wears out. But now that I have the skirt attached, I can go ahead and start finishing off all of the edges for that canvas portion. I did find instructions from the era that do specify putting a tape around all the edges, which is pretty typical for modern tailoring as well, and this tape means that you can draw it in a little tighter in areas where you need it to curve towards the body, and make sure that nothing stretches out, even if it's not cut on the straight grain. This just gets whipped down to the exterior fabric at the very edge, and then to the canvas on the other side of the tape. And then the seam lines can be folded and fell down to the canvas. Then we can move on to assembling the back. The center back seam runs down to just below the waist in back, and the skirts are cut in one with the back body. This means that there will have to be a little clip at the bottom of the center back seam in order to open up that vent and have them cross over each other. There are lots of different ways to finish off the vent. In my case, I'm starting off by folding back the edge of that center back for the skirt panels, just because, like I said, it needs to be a finished edge, so I'm just folding it back and felling over it. This will be enough to protect that edge from fraying out, and so I'm not going to fold it over twice to get a completely finished edge. It's just too bulky. Up at the top, I'm folding down the upper portions, so that way that does have a clean finished edge. We have a nice square shape to start with. You want to make sure that you're not attaching these down at an angle, because then that's going to skew the way the entire skirt falls. So it's very important to make sure that these are at the angle that it needs to be for the body, and that it looks square to each other at the top, which might mean that it's not actually square. So double check that on the body if possible. To finish it off, I'm just felling it down and doing some top stitching along the bottom to create a box shape on the exterior, which seems pretty typical. There are lots of different types of boxes and types of stitches that are used here though, so there's not one right way to stitch this exact portion. Before I add the fronts to the back, I'm going to add a small strip of linen canvas to reinforce where the pocketing is going to go in. This can run down the entire back pleat, but I'm just putting it where the pocket goes. It is cut on the straight grain and then steamed into the curve to get over the hip. And then I'm able to start attaching the fronts to the back at the side seam first. This seam will be backstitched and opened up. You'll notice this is also one of the few places where I have a slightly wider seam allowance, and that's considered an inlay, meaning that there's a little bit of extra left there just in case adjustments need to be made. In order to connect the two skirts, I folded and pressed back the front skirt edge, and now I'm overlaying the back skirt edge and basting it really close to the edge of the front folded piece, so that way I can insert the pocket. The pocketing is just a glazed cotton. That seems really typical for pockets of this era, but anything that is a sturdy textile can do here. And basting so that way I can get everything into place and even before I stitch it together. This allows me to make sure that the sides of the pocketing do line up where they need to be and everything is even and in place. This is also why I did that basting so close to the folded edge, so that way I can get the pocket just far enough into the seam allowance. It's set back about 1/2 inch or so from the edge of the fold, so that way when wearing you won't visibly see the pocket from the exterior, unless of course you're reaching in there. So it's this great little hidden pocket in a nicely reinforced area, so that way it doesn't bow and bend out of shape. The pocket opening is felled in on both sides, making sure to not go through to the exterior on the folded front skirt, but I do want to make sure I'm catching that linen stay strip that I put in there. The top of the pocket is reinforced by stitching it to the waist seam. This is really important to do this in a very strong stitch with a very strong thread, because that's where your weight is going to pull from if you put anything in those back pockets. And I will be stitching through that multiple times with the other layers too to add reinforcement. The bottom of the pocket, you just need to seam it up however you want. You don't have to worry about finishing it off because we will have a lining in that front, so I just did a back stitch to finish off the bottom. The rest of the opening for the skirt can then get back stitched together. I ran the back stitching at the same line that the pocketing was placed into, so about 1/2 inch from that edge. With the sides taken care of, we can now attach the fronts and the backs at the shoulder seams. This is also done with a back stitch and then pressed open. Moving on to the collar next, this is the first place we're going to see the use of that red wool flannel. The undercollar I did cut on the straight, which I do kind of question my choice on that. There are examples both on the straight and on the bias. I'm used to bias being more common later, but I tried a little bit of both. So the red wool is cut on the bias and the undercollar is cut on the straight grain. Hence why there is a seam in the center for the red wool. There will also be a seam in the center for the canvas. That I definitely felt like it had to be on the bias in order to get the curve around the neck and the stretch that is needed. And everything then gets basted into place. I'm only basting along the center of these because everything's going to be pad stitched together and folded and curved as I pad stitch in order to get the right shape. Meaning that gradually as I go, the pieces will start to shift. And as we curve over the neckline, some will extend further than others, and so I don't want to prevent them from doing that. That's the entire point of pad stitching the collar, in order to work a permanent shape into these layers, essentially quilting a curve into your collar. So I'm doing this over the side of my hand and making sure that I'm curving it the correct direction as I go. Again, using this older style of pad stitching in the pattern style that is shown in the DAR book, which is a little different than the modern pad stitching for collars that I'm used to doing, but it still worked pretty well. You can see that it sort of bubbles up at the center there where I was pushing the curve into it in order to get where the fold line is for the neck. And once everything is finished with pad stitching, I'm again trimming back the extra of the red wool flannel and of that interfacing, so that way it does not interfere with where I need to fold the wool over. I'm not putting tailoring tape on the collar, and instead I am just folding over the seam allowance and felling it down. We can then move on to adding the red wool flannel to the body. This piece doesn't extend past the center front, and it doesn't extend quite as far over into the side as the canvas does, but it does extend all the way to the center back. So instead of having a shoulder seam there, it is cut in one with the front and the back. This I'm basting into place around all of the edges, and at this point we're going to go ahead and start attaching the buttons. That's right, before we're anywhere near being done. And that's because this allows you to put them on and hide all of the knots and the stitches and back. I'm going ahead and attaching the linen canvas to the red wool at the shoulder seams, so that way those are anchored together. And now we can move on to attaching the collar, since most of our neckline area is taken care of. This collar will sort of get top stitched by way of a felling stitch to the body of the coat. The seam allowance for this won't be pressed open, but the unevenness of the seam allowance will be made up for in the lining facing the other direction. It's at this point that I will put the upper collar on, because this allows me to get it stitched to the edges, first basting it together and then going through and doing a felling stitch from the underside. But this allows me to double check how it folds over that fold, because again, as you are folding multiple layers, you will need different sizes, so it might be good to leave a little bit of extra seam allowance at the neck for your overcollar just in case. This then can get catch stitched down to the seam allowance and to some of those interfacing pieces to connect everything together. And we can start working on the facing, which is its own complicated mess of things very specific to this era. I expected to find that there was a wool facing in the center front area, but on the sides, in earlier styles, there is nothing there. There is no lining. It stops before you get to that side back seam. But in the 1840s, you start to see more and more examples that have a quilted and padded piece in the side panel. That gives you all of that curve that you're looking for. Now, I did multiple layers for this. I started off with just the silk twill, then I had a layer of batting. They would have used a wool batting. I used a cotton because I'm really allergic to wool, especially when I'm breathing in the fibers. And then I used a layer of cotton underneath to reinforce that, to keep it from stretching, because the twill was definitely a little fidgety. And I found at least one example that showed a bit of printed cotton sticking out from the side. This wasn't enough for the body shape that I wanted, really wanting a very severe curve to the sides of the chest area. So I added 2 more layers of that batting in that were sort of moon shaped, that went from underneath the arms, around the sides of the chest, and up towards the shoulders. At that point, once everything was stitched together, I was able to start placing it in the body and getting it fitted in. The garment is pretty curvy already. It's got lots of shapes, even though it's got very few seams and no darts. So it took a little bit of extra work and time to make sure that everything got spread evenly and would fall over the body without creating wrinkles or fighting back. Once I was sure of that, everything could be basted into place, and then I could start to stitch around the neckline, felling it down around the front and bottom edges, where I used a spaced back stitch as a prick stitch, so that way both the top and bottom side have the same appearance of stitch. Then we can move back to dealing with the skirt and facing that. Now, again, I don't have a cut edge, so I have to do this a little bit differently than they usually did with their broadcloths of the era. I folded up the bottom of the back, and the front is faced all the way to the hem. In a lot of the examples that I saw, they only face down to the last, 4 or 5 inches, and then just a tiny strip faced the front edge, and the bottom was left loose and open. This again requires me to have cut edges that work for that, which these don't. I do know that with the cut edge, if I fell over it, that will hold well enough. So I'm using that technique here in conjunction with folding over the exterior seam allowance, so that way I only have 3 layers of wool that I'm dealing with at the edges rather than 4. So everything around the edges of this skirt facing is connected by way of a felling stitch. I'm then working at the waist seam to catch down the lining to the waist, and then put the skirt facing up over that, fell it down again with that cut edge, and I did some reinforcement stitches across the waistline as well to make sure that everything was anchored well together, because that is an area that's going to get a lot of stress. The side of the lining is caught down to the seam. You'll notice pretty quickly here as I go forward that there isn't a full back lining. It is typical that they leave the back pretty unlined, and the only portion of that that will actually be finished off is at the top part of the shoulders. This allows you to finish off the neckline where the collar attaches and add reinforcement in an area that gets lots of wear and tear. So these side seams will finish there, and then these back facings, which I'm doing this weird little pinking stitch to that I saw in quite a few originals, will just reinforce and cover up the upper portion of the back and the shoulder area. So these tailcoats typically don't have a full body lining, regardless of whether they are a summer or winter garment. Once we attach this back facing to the front facings at the shoulder seam and lay it down, we're going to have to start connecting all of our layers together. This is done with a bunch of horizontal lines of spaced back stitches that go through all of the layers except the exterior one. So this is visible from the interior but not the exterior, and holds all of those layers together, because the red wool flannel really isn't attached in very many other places. So once we have everything anchored into place, we can then start doing some of our final finishing. There typically is a little strap that goes across the inside of that lower back section. This helps to finish off and reinforce some of those little clips that we had to put into the seams at the center back and at those side pleats, and this finishes it off nicely and adds a little bit of reinforcement there as well. It's not heavily stitched in from what I can tell, and some of them are surprisingly decorative, but it is there to cover up the little cut portions and make sure that those openings and splits are reinforced. Then it is on to the sleeves. This is the simplest part of the whole garment, but still took a lot of research. The sleeves of this era tend to have vents down at the bottom along with their cuffs. So while the vast majority of the sleeve is just back stitched together, we're leaving that back seam open by a few inches down at the bottom, and then we will be attaching a cuff. I did find that some cuffs were actually flared out, some were tapered in. Some of them have extension pieces for the underlap sides, so that way when you button them, they don't actually get any smaller. I did not add an underlap to mine, in part because my wrists are much tinier than the rest of my arms, so this will actually allow it to fit better to my wrist area by not having the underlap, but also I just didn't get that cut into it. It's not a big deal. The next time around, I might try doing that. Both the lining and the upper sleeve only extend down to the cuff, and the cuff folds up and over that lining fabric in order to finish it off. The openings for the vent down at the bottom on the underlap side, I just went ahead and folded over the cotton and felled it down. But for the overlap side, one of the notes that I found was that they added a small piece of brown wool in order to reinforce where the buttonhole is going to be, and that makes perfect sense. It also allows me to cut back some of the cotton lining just a little bit, so that way I'm not going through all of that bulk right at the edge, and everything for that piece gets felled down. It's also great because if you have the vent fold back just a little bit, you won't see a flash of the lining, you'll instead just see more brown wool. The interior of the cuff can then be felled up to the cotton lining and to the seam allowance of the exterior, as well as along the edges to finish it all off. And then it's time to insert the sleeves, everyone's favorite part. Hooray! Thankfully, wool is really forgiving for this part. There is a fair amount of fullness that needs to happen at the top of these sleeves. If we were, say, going back to 1830s, there'd be even more, and I'd probably have to gather it in rather than just sort of easing it in as I stitch. But for this, because of that fullness at the top, it's really important to put a little bit of wadding at the top. I'm using the same cotton wadding that I put in the chest area, and I'm just folding over a strip and whipping it down to the seam allowance so that way it will fill out the top part of the sleeve head nicely. Stitch the lining in as well, and we are nearly to the end of this project. We just have, 16 buttonholes to take care of. So the buttonholes run all the way up the front edges, there are 6 per side, and then there are 2 on each one of these sleeves to take care of. I did notice with the button strips up the front edge that they do switch which side they're doing the buttonhole from once the lapel starts to fold back. Next I have to figure out these pants. Trousers. Pantaloons?